Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capitol Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We are once again coming to you just a few blocks from Florida's capital, and we're here at the Florida Cable Telecommunications Association's headquarters in our studios. I am once again joined by Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida, here for a midsummer check-in. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so midsummer, right? We think things are slowing down, but really, it's still very active out there, and there's a lot going on in Florida policy and politics.
There's been a lot of news over the last week or two.
Right. Not to mention over the holiday break. Okay, so let's jump right in. Medical marijuana. John Morgan has said no smoke is a joke. What is the next move for John Morgan on the marijuana?
He's actually said more than that,
right.
and some in four-letter variations. But yeah, I mean, John Morgan, the well-known Orlando trial lawyer, filed a lawsuit last week in Leon County against a new, related to a new law that the legislature passed in special session last month on carrying out the medical marijuana constitutional amendment. The legislature put a provision in that bill that basically bans patients from smoking medical marijuana. They could vape it, they could use it, other forms of cannabis, but they couldn't smoke it. And Morgan, who was really the one who largely bankrolled the constitutional amendment and led this drive for years to pass it, argues that that was not the intent of voters, that voters anticipated that patients would be able to smoke medical marijuana. And so he filed a lawsuit basically saying the legislature has violated the constitutional amendment. We're kind of at an initial stage. We don't know how long this is going to play out. The defense that the state is making, the legislature has made, are a couple grounds. One of which is that it's smoking in and of itself is not a safe act. That you're effectively harming your lungs,
ingesting carcinogens,
exactly,
whatnot, right.
And you shouldn't be in the guise of helping patients. Be inhaling smoke. So that's one of the reasons. They also say that knowing the proper dosages of medical marijuana to help patients is more difficult when it's smoked as opposed to ingested in other ways. Law enforcement also has been against the smoking of medical marijuana. And I think part of that is, at least, there's maybe a few reasons, but it's going to be easier to enforce if flat out people can't smoke because they don't have if nobody is smoking it or legally smoking it, it's easier to enforce because you see somebody smoking medical marijuana, they're doing it illegally.
Right.
So that's another factor. But Morgan argues that it was always the intent that this would be able to be smoked, and he's very insistent. He indicated even before the legislature passed this law that he was going to challenge it, and he quickly did.
Any rumors out there as to the fact that smoking then is the next step for recreational marijuana?
Well, he has made that argument that the legislature, by throwing this impediment to smoking, may actually create more motivation for the backers of legalizing recreational marijuana to get moving on another initiative, for instance, to legalize recreational. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a harder sell to Florida voters than medical marijuana was. But it's happening in other states. So. And there's clearly an industry out there building around this whole medical marijuana market that I'm sure would love to see recreational marijuana legalized in Florida.
Well, we'll stay tuned to see what happens with the lawsuit and the application of the law. Okay, so next, let's go to Washington, D.C. They are impacting Florida, and they're impacting our Secretary of State, Ken Denster, and they have asked for the voter rolls because they're looking at fraud in the voting process. Where does that stand? Is Florida just going to cough up all the info, or what's happening?
Well, this has been it's been very controversial nationally, and not only Democrats criticizing this request, but in a lot of places Republicans have criticized it too. This Trump Commission did ask for voter information from all 50 states. And on Thursday, Ken Denster, the Secretary of State of Florida, said that Florida will turn over information that would otherwise be publicly available. Political parties, for instance, gather through the state's open records laws, are able to gather a large amount of voter data. I mean, names, addresses, voting histories, some identifying.
FOIA-able, Freedom of Information
it
Act,
is public.
accessible. Right.
So Detzner's decision was, and I assume the governor's office as well was involved in this, is that information they will turn over to this Trump commission. What they're not turning over is things like the commission asked for the last 4 digits of Social Security numbers. They also asked for driver's license numbers. Those sorts of things that are unique identifiers that have been used in some financial types of fraud. Very can be sensitive types of information. Right. The other thing is, I think there's a lot of concern. Again, it's not just Democrats, although they have been hammering the Scott administration about this. But I think there's Republicans out there who are kind of leery about turning over too much personal information to Washington, to the federal government.
But really, the case that gets made there is, how can you reconcile a phantom voter if you don't have that second piece of data to match it up with?
Well, and I think that's what we're going to have to watch long term is if this commission starts making accusations of widespread voter fraud and they're matching up incomplete information to arrive at those conclusions, are those conclusions going to be valid? That's why I think this debate is going to continue over time, because I have to think that commission's going to come up with some conclusions that there was voter fraud. And then it's going to be a situation where, well, can you prove it? Right. So but to your point, I think it makes it harder to actually nail down whether fraud has occurred if they don't have those unique.
And will the commission be able to reach across the department, if you will, to maybe access the IRS or somebody like that to reconcile data?
Well, even with what Detzner did the other day, the Democrats have spent the whole weekend hammering the Scott administration for turning over even the more limited amount of information. But the reality is that the commission probably could have filed a public records request with the state and gotten the same information. Right. So, but I don't think the Democrats are going to let this go, because this whole voter fraud issue has been a point of major contention over the last couple of years, especially with President Trump making some of the allegations he's made.
Right. All right. Well, let's step away from policy and voter fraud or whatnot, and let's step over to the election side. Right. We are now full blown into election season, and one of Florida's gubernatorial candidates, Andrew Gilliam, mayor of Tallahassee, is finding his campaign in disarray. Let's talk about that. What's happening there?
Well, the latest was that some of his top campaign aides have resigned. One, the campaign manager, I believe, and another one, a finance director. That all happened last week. Gilliam has a number of problems. In May, he didn't raise much money, which, this is the time of the campaign when you really start need to put money away and salting it away and to be prepared for really the long run. But I also think the major issue out there is that there is an FBI investigation of the city of Tallahassee and some dealings in the city of Tallahassee. And we don't know whether Gilliam is implicated. He says he's talked to the FBI and that they have told him he's not implicated in it. But, you can about write those ads yourself if you're running against him, that while he's the mayor, the FBI is investigating possible wrongdoing in the city government. He's got that to deal with as well right now. You got to figure that when they are making phone calls to make money or to get contributions, that some people are going to be a little squeamish to give them a whole lot of money right now when this thing is hanging over the city's head and to a certain extent his head. So, we haven't really heard much from any of the other candidates about Gilliam's problems, but you can bet they're watching it pretty closely. And at this point, the other Democratic candidates in the gubernatorial race are Gwen Graham and Chris King, a businessman out of Orlando area. And and on the Republican side, Adam Putnam is just piling up money for his race. There's a lot of talk still continuing that Richard Corcoran, the House Speaker, may get in as well.
Right. And Chair of Senate Appropriations, Jack Latvala.
He also is considering it, and I think pretty soon we'll know one way or another, whether he will get in. I mean, again, you've got to start raising money at this point, unless you're independently wealthy enough to fund your own campaign, and I'm not sure any of them are.
Well, I tell you what, that campaign cycle is not just in the mayor's race, but we're also seeing some of those local races in Orlando, the special election in Miami as well. The parties are out raising money hand over fist, and then you've got gubernatorial candidates on top of that, out hitting up the usual suspects.
Well, I think the biggest race to watch is the special election, the Senate district down in Miami-Dade. I mean, the Democrats really thought they should have won that seat in 2016, and they got kind of tangled up in their candidates, and they lost it pretty handily to Frank Artilles. But then Artilles had to resign in April after a well-publicized outburst at a club here in Tallahassee. And on both sides, you've got candidates lining up, and the Democrats are trying to win that seat. Republicans have Jose Felix Diaz, who just left the House to run for this seat, and Alex Diaz de la Portilla, a former senator. Those guys are going at it hard on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, you got Annette Taddeo, who was lieutenant governor candidate a few years ago, and Anna Rivas Logan, who was a former state rep. I mean, both sides have candidates that are going to really slug that out over the next few months.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see how those races shake out, and then the effects on gubernatorial, and then the big fundraising starts for everybody else, right?
Exactly. Well, we got a U.S. Senate race next year too. So.
All right. Well, let's jump into the Supreme Court. Let's step away from campaigns. Supreme Court is just about to go on vacation, and so we're expecting potentially some rulings happening there. What's going on?
Well, the Supreme Court's on Thursday is going to issue its final regular opinions for a month or so, a little more than a month. They can rule on other stuff during the summer, but typically there's some big stuff that comes out in that final batch, and I think one of the ones to watch particularly is the issue of the state attorney down in Orange County, Aramis Ayala, who has basically said she's not going to pursue the death penalty against any defendants, really. And Governor Scott shifted about 24 cases away from her, death penalty cases, to Brad King, who's the state attorney up in Ocala. Ayala has challenged the legality of the governor being able to do this, and they've had oral arguments on that case. And I expect the Supreme Court to rule fairly quickly. I mean, there's a lot of cases pending. When you got that many cases, and some of them are very high profile as well, I would tend to think the court would try to get that issue resolved.
Any handicapping on where the court's sitting right now?
The reporting that went on at the hearing, I was not at the hearing, but from what I understand, that the court was pretty skeptical of Ayala's arguments that, her attorneys basically are saying that the governor could not step in and shift those cases away. And from the justices' questions and stuff, they appeared to be skeptical of that. We don't know that they're going to rule this week. Supreme Court has a lot of leeway in terms of when they rule, but I tend to think that may be the biggest thing out there, at least an immediate standpoint. The other thing to watch over the next month or so is Governor Scott last week set a date for the first execution in Florida in almost 2 years. There's been all this legal wrangling and about the death penalty sentencing system, and he set the execution date for, I believe it's August 24th, for a death row inmate who was convicted in 2 murders in Jacksonville back in the 80s. So there's going to be a whole lot of legal maneuvering, and the Supreme Court will have to in some way act on that before the 24th, whether to allow the execution to go forward or to block it.
Well, that's an intricate case, and it's an intricate process. So we'll have to wait to see how the Supremes rule, and then what rolls after that.
Yeah.
All right. So let's step away from the Supreme Court and let's go to some of the staffing changes and new folks. We have Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater. Stepped away and, or I should say, retired from public service, and now is working at FAU. And Governor appointed a replacement. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, he appointed Jimmy Petronas, who a lot of us knew as a state representative. He was in the House for 8 years, and then the governor appointed him to the Public Service Commission, and now the governor's appointed him to Chief Financial Officer. So Petronas was an early political supporter of the governor. I mean, when most Republicans were running the other way back in 2010, Petronas was with him. And I think I think it shows, I think we've seen this again and again with the governor, that loyalty means a lot to him. And so Petronas is the new chief financial officer. He's a restaurateur. His family owns a restaurant well-known restaurant out in Panama City. So I think a lot of people are trying to sort of handicap if he runs next year for that seat, how that will play. Right now, the Republicans don't have anybody else running for chief financial officer, at least no one announced. Jeremy Ring, a former senator, is running on the Democratic side. But Petronas, like I said, he's very close to the governor. One other sort of thing that nobody's talking much about on this is that the governor is going to have 3 appointments to the Public Service Commission in the next by the end of the year. He had 2 scheduled anyway, and now he's going to appoint one for Petronas. I know it's kind of wonky, Public Service Commission, utility regulation stuff, but this is important stuff. I mean,
People's power bill.
It is one of the most important agencies around because it determines, your power bill. It determines whether nuclear plants go forward or don't go forward. I mean, it's an important agency, and the governor's going to be able to put more of his people on there.
Right. Well, you've got those 3 there, but now in the cabinet, the governor now has an appointee on the cabinet versus someone that was elected. And in the past, we had seen disagreement, if you will, with the governor's position from that post when it was served with Chief Atwater?
There were a couple instances when Chief Financial Officer Atwater and the governor clashed. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
One of which was probably the best known was they clashed over the insurance commissioner, and Atwater basically blocked who the governor wanted to appoint as insurance commissioner. Now they agreed in the end on David Altmaier to be the insurance commissioner, but Atwater is a pretty low-key guy in terms of not publicly clashing with people, but there were instances when he did not go along with the governor.
Right.
Now I think most people expect that Petronas will be, more closely tied to the governor, and the cabinet does all sorts of issues. I mean, they do land acquisition. They do, they oversee the state pension investments. I mean, it's a multifaceted
But you never
job.
know when a huge issue is going to come up before the cabinet.
That's right. I mean, they make appointments to certain agencies and to head certain agencies. So it's a big deal.
Well, we'll stay tuned to see how that cabinet composure changes with the addition of Chief Financial Officer Petronas. We'll have to get used to saying that.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll stay tuned for new articles from the News Service of Florida, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today's episode of Capital Dateline. Please tune in to our Facebook page at Capital Dateline Online, or check us out on our Twitter handle, which is @the FCTA. Thanks for tuning in.